Hi, this is your host Apil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us Navroop Mitter, CEO and founder of ArmorText's. Navroop, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure to host you here, and this is the first time I'm talking to you or to someone from ArmorText. So I am also curious about the history and the story of the company. So talk a bit about what is ArmorText all about, and what problem you saw in this ecosystem, in this space, that you felt that we need ArmorText.
Yeah, so a number of years ago, we were actually engaged with a telecom company based out of Europe, and I was there helping build out a cybersecurity practice when we first saw the first inklings of what became the enterprise collaboration tools that we see today. Things like Teams and Slack weren't released yet, but the nascent beginnings of them were. And while I was there in Europe working with this telecom, providing cybersecurity consulting services and building out a practice, they actually asked me to look at the future intersection of mobility and security. Long story short, we made a number of predictions about the rise of messaging within the enterprise, the future transparency requirements that were likely to happen from a regulatory compliance perspective, but then also the kind of limitations that would be a part of these platforms because of when they were being built out, right? If you remember back in 2011, 2012, 2013, the kinds of phones we carried in our pockets aren't the supercomputers we have in there today, right? The iPhone of that era and the iPhone 15 and 16 I now carry are radically different technologies. So we knew that any communications capabilities built during that era were going to rely on the same security paradigms of the past. Encryption over the wire and encryption at rest, right? TLS in transit, encryption at rest. But with the movement of these kinds of communications outside of your firewall into the, beyond your firewall, off premise, into the cloud, reality was we were going to start to exacerbate the kinds of insider threats that organizations were already dealing with. That is, an admin like an Edward Snowden having gone rogue and looking at communications they shouldn't be seeing, or third parties now breaking in and being able to see everything. When we developed ArmorText, the use case we specifically developed it for was to provide that secure out-of-band collaboration capability that you're going to need if and when your organization was breached. If an adversary breaks into your network, one of the first things they're going to do is they're going to start to perform reconnaissance and surveillance on communications of key personnel. ArmorText provides an end-to-end encrypted channel of communication that allows you to have safe, protected communications, but to do so in a manner that still allows you to meet your regulatory, statutory, and legal requirements, like an ability to have user management, policy enforcement, or the ability to have retained archives. If you think about the consumer technologies that we all know and love, like a Signal or a WhatsApp, that also provide end-to-end encryption, they do so in a manner that was designed around consumer privacy. And that often conflicts with enterprise requirements. They don't have an ability to give you user management or policy enforcement. You can't suddenly remove the executive that had just gone rogue or call communications back when they shouldn't have been sent out. You also don't have the ability to have a retained set of archives. ArmorText gives you the ability to have end-to-end encrypted retained archives.
Let's also talk about how the whole market is changing, because the focus of today's discussion is also about moving from pre-breach to post-breach. Now, what happens is that teams can be as prepared as they can be, but when something goes wrong, it does go wrong, and then it throws everything into chaos. But realistically, how you're seeing the shift that is happening in the market right now, and then we'll talk about what is the right approach. Both are needed. You have to be prepared, in advance, but you also have to be prepared after the fact something has gone wrong. So what are the trends that you're seeing in this space?
One of the interesting things we've seen over the past 12 months is not only are companies looking to say, hey, wait a minute, no matter what we've invested in pre-breach, no matter how many firewalls we've set up, no matter how many new scanning technologies we've introduced, no matter how many new threat intelligence or detection and response capabilities we have, the reality is the adversary is still managing to break in. It means the probability of encountering a breach at some point is basically 1, right? And given that, they're coming to this realization that while they've invested so heavily in pre-breach preventative measures, they are under-indexed on their investments in post-breach preparedness. The companies are seeing that, so are vendors, and as a result, so are the venture capitalists who are financing them. And so over the last 12 months, we've seen this sudden shift towards post-breach preparedness. And a significant part of that is because of the increasing use of tabletop exercises that aren't just focused on the nerds in the basement, right? Technologists like myself who are literally sitting in their basements right now discussing tech, but actually moving that emphasis to the executive tier, right? So you have the SEC rules changes, you have NIS2 and DORA from the regulatory landscape. They're all basically coming back and saying, your executives, your board need to be prepared to play a greater role in cybersecurity oversight, but also in particular incident response oversight. And as a result, they're now starting to use tabletop exercises and other tools to better prepare and understand what their role and responsibilities are under those conditions. And through that, you're starting to see this shift in mindset and understanding that, okay, if a breach is inevitable, we now need to actually start to invest in better post-breach preparedness.
What are some of the key preparations? I run a show, CISO Insights, and with Steve Winterfield from Akamai, and he always says that you can't protect what you can't see. So you need to have very good visibility into what you're going to protect. So can you also talk about how teams should prepare, and are you happy with the processes that are already in place, or you feel that they are not doing enough?
So from a post-breach perspective, you may not be able to see anything, or you might be able to see things, but you've also got an adversary who's able to see everything as well. So one of the most often found gaps in post-breach preparedness is that organizations typically lack a truly identified, managed, implemented, and practiced out-of-band communication solution. So much so that, for example, in the manufacturing space, Dragos, which is a provider of OT technology, EDR capabilities, they run a tabletop exercise practice. And what Dragos shared at the European Summit this year was that their own findings from running all those tabletops was that 70% of organizations had failed to identify and or practice and implement an out-of-band communication strategy. They would not know how to communicate should there be some sort of OT incident. When we think about, the organizations who have just gone through a breach, one of the first things that they do is they start to invest in greater post-breach preparedness. And 55% of organizations, this comes from the IBM cost of a data breach study, post a breach, if they increase their cybersecurity budgets, that's actually what they're investing in. And so oftentimes it's communications that were the most significant gap during that period. You have organizations that are finding that when they go into an incident, they're having to reestablish communications lines, and that they can't actually go through any of the remediation or response efforts until that has been done. They can't coordinate the regulatory disclosures they need to make to the SEC. They can't coordinate shareholder communications. They can't coordinate communications to the media and to the public. And they're having to reestablish comms before they can really do anything else, because if you can't communicate, you can't remediate. If you can't communicate, you can't operate. And so they're spending time then in the middle of an incident having to light up brand new workspaces, onboard people, vet them, continue to move forward. And that loss in productivity there could be on the order of magnitudes of millions of dollars. If you have an organization that's got, say, 1,000 employees and they're now cut off from being able to do their roles during incident response, and you have a 3-day period during which you're now reestablishing secure lines of communication, 8 hours a day at an average bill rate, you're looking at anywhere from $2 to $8 million in lost productivity.
And can you also talk about, when you look at cybersecurity, are you seeing less attacks? Are you seeing more attacks? Or you're seeing less attacks because we are becoming more and more, security is no longer an afterthought. It is becoming a priority. It is becoming a board level discussion. So you're like, yes, the attacks are less, but they're becoming more sophisticated. I just want to understand the state of cyber attacks these days.
Yeah, what we're seeing, at least from our customers and from our partners, is that the attacks are evolving. It's not that they're more or that they're less, but that they're evolving. In fact, in some cases, attacks are actually becoming easier, right? You had probably seen with Scattered Spider and some of the affiliate networks, they were actually starting to use ransomware as a service or capabilities as a service, right? The attackers themselves are starting to develop more mature ecosystems of their own, while we as organizations are developing better defensive capabilities, even better post-breach response capabilities. The attackers are now saying, hey, we're going to evolve. We're going to start to build out investment communities of our own, cross-invest in each other. We're going to start to light up certain specialist services, providing ransomware as a service, as an example, or this kind of credential attack as a service. And then you can choose to how to put the pieces together leverage that for your attack. Here's an affiliate program. If you actually help bring the attack or the new revenue source into us, we will cut you in. They're now developing mature networks of organizations that work together hand in hand. That means they've also got maturity around things like HR and benefits management. We're seeing attackers that are actually advertising to recruit candidates, and they're offering, significant sign-on bonuses and PTO and, other benefits that you would traditionally actually, see as something we would normally have in the private sector, or if you're working on the good side of the house, and now we're actually seeing them on the other side of the house as well.
Now let's talk about regulations. A lot of work is being done here in the U.S. A lot of work is being done in the European Union as well. Can you talk about some of the progressive? When we talk about public sector, you have to be very careful because sometimes intentions are good, but the implementations are bad. CRA is a very good example there. So talk about some of the efforts and how does that impact the security industry?
I think one of the best things we've seen is increasingly, whether it's the SEC rules changes or whether it's NIS2 and DORA, there's this emphasis on escalating security within the enterprise to a C-suite and board level conversation. And the way they've contributed to doing that is by mandating better cybersecurity oversight as well as incident response oversight. By putting that squarely on the executives and the boards and potentially even saying, hey, you might face either civil and or in Europe, potentially even criminal liabilities, depending on what actions take place. It's causing the conversation to happen in places where it didn't necessarily happen before. Conversations we're seeing happen now, oftentimes, post a tabletop, will be very different than they were 2-3 years ago. You're seeing the GC get involved and saying, wait a minute, here's what we're doing for post-breach preparation. We had left our cybersecurity teams orphaned on how they would potentially communicate. They chose a consumer-oriented technology because that's what would allow them to coordinate their response. But really what they needed was an enterprise-ready capability. And we wouldn't finance it for them. We wouldn't give them the budget. How do we address that problem? Because this is now a compliance level concern at this level. And so you're seeing some positive impacts to the regulatory side. Now, are the regulations going to solve everything? No. Do we want the regulations to ever become so prescriptive as to say, adopt technology A, adopt technology B, and adopt technology C, and then you're covered and you're good? Absolutely not. We don't want that to happen either. But I am seeing, at least when it came to, say, for example, NIS2, some improvements in how they describe the kinds of things your organization would want to be prepared with. Again, an example is for operational resilience, they define in Article 21, paragraph 2J, the functional characteristics of the kind of communications technologies you're going to need to have in place in order to effectively do incident response. They don't tell you what to buy, but they say functionally you're likely need to A, B, and C. Then in Recital 98, they actually go on to talk about the benefits of end-to-end encryption, rather than some of the concerns that other members of the EU have previously stated, right? They're actually talking about, hey, when it comes to operational resilience, incident response, when it comes to these kinds of communications you're likely to engage in with, a CERT at your organization or at the national level, you're going to need better protection for those communications. They actually start to address that. Again, they don't lay out prescriptively what things have to be, but they do start to discuss kind of those functional and technical requirements. So it gives you a starting point for that evolved discussion internally to say, hey, look, here are things that we need to be better prepared. Even the lawmakers have now recognized this, so we're going to now need to adjust our investments moving forward.
When we talk about cybersecurity, IDP, that also becomes a factor. Social engineering becomes a factor. This is, I don't even want to open a can of worm. There are a lot of established mode of communications, emails are there, Slacks are there. There are tons of there. Do you feel that these means are adequate? You cannot, security industry can protect them, or you do feel that we need, either another layer or different mode of communication to ensure the breaches don't happen?
So if we go back to 2017, when the NotPetya ransomware attacks hit, Mondelez's experience was something like 1,700 servers getting lost, 24,000 laptops. Suddenly people had to turn to WhatsApp to reestablish lines of communications, and they built out phone trees in order to communicate. Over the years, then, as we moved towards the cloud, many organizations just assumed that because their email was now hosted in the cloud, that because their Zoom was in the cloud, that because their Slack or their Teams was in the cloud, that redundancy and ability to communicate would give them resilience in the face of an attacker. What we've come to find, though, is that, especially in some of these recent attacks where the IDP has been compromised, is that the attacker actually weaponized the IDP against the organization. And what they did was they either blocked your access to all of those different communications tools that were in IDP integrated, right? So email, your VTC, your chat solutions, your video solutions, all of those were suddenly unreachable. Or they weaponized it against you to actually provision their own access in so they could follow you. So no matter where you moved your conversation about remediation and response, they were already there listening in. And that weaponization of the IDP is kind of a key example of how these kinds of things can go wrong, right? So zero trust is great from a day-to-day perspective. From a day-to-day perspective, all these technologies absolutely should be integrated into the IDP because that's a key component in enforcing zero trust throughout your environment. But once that breach takes place, the requirement somewhat inverts, right? All the technologies that had been integrated in your IDP, either inaccessible or now compromised, and your adversary is able to follow you throughout all of them and anything you're doing on them, potentially watch in. And so suddenly out-of-band preparedness means having communications capabilities that are resilient against a credential attack, that are more secure than your existing communications technologies, but that are also not integrated with IDP on purpose so they don't go down when you need them most, and yet offer you the ability to account for things like out-of-band onboarding. How is it that you are going to introduce new people should new individuals or new personnel or incident responders or others need to be brought into the communication, right? And so it's a whole different ballgame. One of the key things is that your incident response capabilities are going to require out-of-band communications moving forward.
Since we are talking about communications and this is one of the hottest technologies, not hottest technology, but at least hottest buzzword these days, which is Gen AI. What role do you see Gen AI can play, or you see that at this point for cybersecurity community, especially for the areas that we are talking about post-breach, there is not that much role?
It's an interesting question. So one of the things that we've been hearing very recently, right? So 6 months ago, very different story. There was a lot of the hype around the impact that Gen AI was going to have on the day-to-day workings of the cybersecurity analyst. What we're actually hearing from a lot of our peers and our customers as they talk about how Gen AI has been implemented by other vendors in the solutions that they use in, as threat analysts or SOC analysts, is that it's actually creating sometimes more work, or it's creating hallucinations that are actually leading to increased effort on their part. It isn't necessarily decreasing their workloads. So I'm not sure that the current generation of Gen AI capabilities that are being introduced are really up to meeting the challenge that everyone thought they were going to solve for today. That said, I think there's another side of this question when it comes to Gen AI that we need to think about as well, is that a lot of the tools that we are developing around Gen AI, particularly for, like, say, the financial services sector, right? The ability to automatically evaluate information and value it, or for the insurance sector to better understand what risks do or do not exist in certain environments, or how to value a patent or things like that. All these kinds of Gen AI capabilities that actually do seem to be relatively successful right now could themselves actually be turned around and weaponized against an organization. If your adversary breaks in, siphons off a whole bunch of information, right? They exfiltrate everything. And then they use Gen AI to actually comb through that material and better identify ways of monetizing that. Suddenly the ransom that they were demanding might actually be the smallest portion of what you're dealing with. You might be dealing with them leveraging insider information to better time the market, or leveraging privileged information about your upcoming patent applications to, kind of head those off at the pass, or selling that information to a competitor, right? And so there are all sorts of new concerns that come up because the Gen AI is potentially able to figure out how to value that information much more rapidly, do the heavy lift for the attacker, and then develop for them a game plan on how to better monetize what they just stole from you. The ransom itself might actually become the smallest piece of this.
This is October. The holiday season is almost here. which also is kind of a beyond Halloween, a nightmare for security folks because the traffic speaks up. How do you see these, seasons affect, and how should organization prepare so that irrespective of the traffic, irrespective of the time of the year is, they have the right strategy in place as we are shifting the focus from pre-breach to post-breach?
Like anything else, right, it's going to be dependent on the business themselves. When I was doing cybersecurity consulting for retail clients, Black Friday was one of their biggest concerns. No new system implementations were taking place post, an early date in September, all the way through the end of Q1 on the calendar year. And that's because they were still dealing with post-holiday returns, as an example. And so they had very specific processes, and they were aligned around their calendar and their seasonality. I think the same thing is true for most organizations, right? Unless you're in energy or some of these other, categories where it's literally throughout the year, there are going to be peaks that you have to deal with, and that's likely going to be a trend that your organization is going to provide insights into. But other than that, I think that old adage always applies. If you dare take a break and go off to dinner or schedule date night, that's when the adversary is going to try to hit you.
Navroop, once again, thank you so much for taking time out today to join me and talk about this, very important shift that is happening from pre-breach to post-breach. Thanks for not only sharing the kind of technology you folks are building, but also the role of culture there, how organizations prepare themselves. It was a great, discussion, great insights there. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.